Hello there everyone, a bit of a different reaction video today. Today's a bit of almost a history lesson for those in Chile. It's about General Augusto Pinochet, who apparently was the dictator of Chile. Some people might say otherwise, but I believe he was overthrown and killed. Yeah. Anyway, my name's King Sloth. I was in the British Army for just under 7 years before transferring across to the Royal Air Force, where I'm currently at the 3rd year in of the Air Force. I'm doing pretty well. I do YouTube on the side, but I'm aiming for 5k subs by the end of this year. Hit a like, comment down below what you reckon I should react to next. But you're not interested in me, you're interested in reactions, so let's get into it.
The man known to history as Augusto Pinochet was born as Augusto José Ramón Pinochet Ugarte in the city of Valparaiso, Chile's second largest city after the capital of Santiago.
I would love to go and visit Santiago.
On November 1915.
Oh, it's not that old, really.
Was also Augusto Pinochet. He was the descendant of an 18th century French immigrant to Chile from Lamballe in the Brittany region of northwestern France.
So his dad was French and he ended up being the General of Chile.
A woman whose ancestors had come to Chile from the Basque region of northeastern Spain. A great proportion of Chile's early settlers had come to the country from this region.
Okay,
She and Augusto Sr. had several children subsequent to Augusto Jr., who was their first child. Gerardo followed in 1917, then Avelina in 1918, Maria in 1920, and Luis in 1922.
Sounds crazy, but also
Augusto's
having a parent
relationship
like
with his
that, how are you
mother
meant
was
to
particularly
continue
close.
your
Years
life
later,
normally
even
after
when
having a
he
father
had
like
become
this?
ruler of Chile, he would continue to visit her every morning before going to work. He also seems to have acquired his ardent Roman Catholicism from her. The Pinochets were a middle-class family of the time. As a result, after being sent to the San Rafael Seminary School at Valparaiso for his primary education, Augusto was subsequently enrolled in the Sagrados Corazones, one of the oldest private schools in South America, which had been established in 1837.
Private school,
he studied there from 1928 onwards.
Well played.
At school, he was given the nickname Donkey, allegedly because of his braying laugh, but some people suspected it was a result of his poor academic performance.
Wow.
His school records reveal an average student, not the worst in the school, but very far from being an accomplished teenager. He did excel at maths, but struggled to even pass some other subjects. He also learned to speak some French, and, as was typical for the time in a profoundly Roman Catholic country, he learned a considerable amount of Latin. It was an unremarkable childhood otherwise, one in which he showed no particular affinity for any profession in particular. Perhaps it was unsurprising then that when he completed his time at Sagrados Corazones, Pinochet enrolled in the Chilean military school in the capital of the country.
As we know, the Chileans love the military.
It was the beginning of a long life in the military, which would profoundly shape the history of modern Chile. Pinochet grew up at the end of a period of unprecedented prosperity in South American countries like Chile. During the first age of globalization, roughly between 1870 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay experienced huge amounts of inward migration from Europe.
Yeah, because everyone wanted to leave. It was no longer safe to be in them areas, which makes sense.
And improved health standards. As it did, tens of millions of Europeans left the old world for the new. As a nation which faced the Pacific Ocean rather than the Atlantic, Chile was not a huge beneficiary of this migration, although a substantial number of Germans, Croats, Irish and other immigrants did arrive.
To Chile?
However, the country did benefit enormously from the economic boom that occurred across Latin America at this time.
All the money's
in particular, it developed a position as the world's foremost supplier of natural nitrates, supplying over 80% of the nitrogen used globally in fertilizers and agricultural chemistry. As a result of this era of prosperity, a relatively stable period of Chile's political history was entered into. Known as the Parliamentary Era, it was one in which the Chilean Congress largely controlled the country's politics rather than an overly powerful presidential executive.
The smarter option,
As successful as this period had been, the earliest years of Pinochet's life saw increasing tensions in Chile. The economy began to take a major hit from the 1900s onwards, as the
a
rise
bit
of
weird then.
artificial nitrates
Like a
reduced
robot.
Chile's control of the global market. This problem became particularly acute from the mid-1910s onwards, as the First World War saw nations switching to alternative sources. Moreover, as
Cheaper,
elsewhere
yeah.
in Europe and in Latin America, the late 19th and early 20th centuries had seen the emergence of increasingly polarized left and right-wing politics in Chile, with the powerful landed upper class favoring conservative politics.
So the cracks start to
rising
appear.
middle and working
That's what
classes
people always say. I'm
preferring
just going to
reform.
pause it. People always say that eventually cracks will appear in any political environment where it's been peaceful for so long. Cracks start to happen. You start to have something to fight against or fight for.
Socialist
That's
presidents.
what happens.
Matters came to a head in 1924 during the presidency of Arturo Alessandri, when the Chilean military effectively engaged in a coup, and a military officer, Luis Altamirano, became president. This
Wow.
was the beginning of a period of immense instability in Chilean
Yeah,
politics.
because the military just took over
For
someone
much
who's
of the
been
20th
elected.
century thereafter, the country would experience intermittent intervention and domination by the military, while the country's politics was increasingly unstable between left and right-wing groupings.
But then
All of
you've got the
this was
military controlling
compounded
it.
by a worsening economic situation, as South America was hit by the Wall Street crash of 1929
Oh
and
my
the
God.
Great Depression which followed it, while Europe and North America would eventually recover from the Depression. South America was hurt by it in ways that continued to have implications for the
That is
continent's
crazy.
economies for decades
Just how big
thereafter.
the crash was.
Pinochet's
is
early
crazy.
career mirrored that of many of Latin America's military dictators during the 20th century, in that his life was largely unremarkable during his youth
He wanted
and
to make
into
a
middle
name
age.
for himself
He
as he got into
specialized in military
Yeah.
geography at the military school in Santiago in the 1930s, before graduating as a second lieutenant. Thereafter, he
Well
was
done.
assigned to a regiment stationed in the city of Concepcion in central Chile,
A lot of
before
people
a
from
brief
Concepcion
assignment in his
in my
hometown of
comments.
Valparaiso. In
So
the
thank
early
you.
1940s, he returned to the military school in Santiago to begin advanced training and studies as an officer. During
Well
these
done.
years, he married Lucia Hiriat Rodriguez, with whom he would have 5 children. 3
Is it
daughters
because,
named Inés, Maria,
I'm guessing
and
Chile's more of a
Javelina,
Catholic country
and
that
2
they have
sons,
lots of
Augusto
children?
and
I'm
Marco.
guessing.
The children were born as Pinochet continued to rise in a slow and steady fashion through the ranks of the Chilean military. By the early 1950s, he was working as a teacher at the military school in the capital,
Which is
having
massive.
carved out a reputation for some ability in the field of military geography. Though how much any of this was based on any novelty in Pinochet's ideas is highly debatable. Notably
Ooh.
in this regard, when he published some work on military literature in the late 1960s and early 1970s, much of it was plagiarized.
Oh,
Finally, in the
So
mid-1950s,
he's
he
a
was
lot- he's
appointed
lying.
as a professor at the Military Academy in Santiago,
That
a
is crazy.
significant enough position to have attained by his 40th year. Pinochet was beginning his ascent through the Chilean military during years when Chile's politics
He
were
lied.
beginning to stabilize in some fashion.
Wow.
After the chaos of the military coups and economic instability of the 1920s and early
Didn't have
1930s,
ChatGPT back then,
some
did they?
order was established from the mid-1930s onwards as the military's role in civil affairs declined and reforms were undertaken. These often combined a mixture of conservative and liberal policies, and
To appease
consequently
both the groups.
managed to placate public opinion throughout all classes of Chilean
Which is
society.
the
economy
smart
was
call.
also buoyed up by moves to nationalize the copper mining industry, with Chile rising to
Which-
become the largest
I believe the copper industry was also messed up by the Americans not long after. I'm guessing they might explain this video, but I believe, get my history right, that America then started taking all the copper from Chile.
producer of
If I
copper in the
remember rightly.
world by a long stretch in the mid-20th century. At the same time, protectionist economic policies were implemented to grow Chilean industry at the expense of outside interests, notably American corporations operating in Latin America.
There
Yet
you go.
these were also years of political flux, as Chile found itself
That's
divided
Santiago,
between
that is.
supporters
I've seen
of a
videos of this.
conservative brand of politics and a more radical leftist approach, one which embraced elements of Marxism and opposed American imperialism in Latin America. From the
In a way, I
1950s
sort of agree with
onwards,
that.
these
Be a
divisions
country that's
focused on
self-sufficient, I
efforts to
agree.
elect a Marxist, socialist president of the country in the shape of Salvador Allende, the head of the Chilean Socialist Party, Allende's path and Pinochet's
look
would
after
become
yourselves.
intertwined in subsequent years. Pinochet's rise through the ranks of the Chilean military continued during the late 1950s and into the 1960s. In 1956,
so it is quite a recent thing. 1960s, he's still working through training
in Ecuador. The more northerly South American nation was one of the least developed countries of the continent,
amazing.
but it had experienced a recent economic boom, owing to the expansion of the banana trade. As a result, the government had come to an agreement with Chile, whereby Santiago would dispatch a detachment of officers to Ecuador to aid the country in developing its first military academy. Pinochet would spend 4.5 years working on this assignment
Chile
abroad.
love their
But it
military
paid off.
and have
In the early
really well
1960s,
established
He
training.
was given command of his own
Sending a
regiment
group
back
to build
in
an
Chile
academy in
for the
Ecuador
first
is
time.
smart
And
as an
in
alloy and as
1963,
general
he was
education
appointed
was.
as a
Amazing.
sub-director of the military academy in Santiago. In the late 1960s, when Pinochet was in his 50s, he was promoted again, first to become the chief of staff of the 2nd Army Division and then as military intendant of the province of Tarapacá in northern Chile, where he had command of the 6th Army
So
Division.
he did well for himself then, military-wise.
Within the military hierarchy for him to have attained. But few would have believed that the man who arrived to Tarapacá in 1969, just over 4 years later, would stand at the helm of the Chilean state.
What happened? I'm guessing stages like a
Pinochet might
coup.
have remained simply a senior military figure within Chile, a prominent one, but one whom the wider world would have heard little about had it not been for the outcome of the 1970 Chilean presidential election.
Did you do it properly?
That year, the Marxist Salvador Allende, who had run unsuccessfully as the Socialist Party candidate in 1952, 1958 and 1964, ran as the candidate of the Popular Unity Coalition, a coalition of left-wing parties and socialist groups. The election was a closely contested affair, one in which both the United States and the Soviet Union took a keen interest and active role. In the end, no one candidate won a clear majority, but Allende emerged victorious with just under 40,000 more votes than his conservative right-wing opponent,
So a very
Jorge
close vote.
Alessandri. Thus it was that Chile elected a Marxist as the head of state of a South American nation for the first time. In the months that followed, Allende initiated a radical reform program, seeking to expand government control over sections of the economy, notably through continued nationalization of the mining industry, as well as
bring it back
education
to your own
reforms
country,
and changes in taxation and
completely
wealth
find valid.
distribution.
Especially when the economy is up and
This
down as it
quickly
is, you need to
brought him into
have
conflict
that
with
stability.
where the socialists did not hold a majority. Meanwhile, the United States looked on, waiting for an opportunity to intervene to remove this dangerous socialist from power in Chile. Economic sanctions were also imposed by Washington to try to damage the Chilean
because Chile want to
economy
become
and make
self-sufficient,
Allende's government unpopular.
America's went,
By
we're not helping you.
1973, unrest at Allende's government was considerable in Chile as a result of the grave social and political unrest which persisted across the country, and the inability of Allende's government to address the problem without greater control over Congress.
Because they didn't have
In
the top level
particular,
votes.
unemployment and inflation were rocketing upwards as US sanctions against Chile hit the country's economy hard. And this was the environment in which Allende's administration would be overthrown and a military junta established in Chile. It would bring
Once again,
Pinochet to power,
military takeover.
but he was perhaps a very peculiar individual to end up fronting the opposition in Allende's government. He had, after all, benefited considerably from Allende's time in office.
My
In
friends
January
do.
1971,
Well
Pinochet
played.
had been promoted yet again, this time to become a division general and the general commander of the Santiago Army Garrison,
So
a
well-respected
highly significant
person in the
position
military.
the Chilean capital. However, a fresh promotion quickly ensued following the assassination of the former Minister of the Interior, Public Works and Finance, Edmundo Pérez Zujovic, by left-wing terrorists while driving through
I was about to say it was
Santiago
going to be.
in June 1971.
I thought it was going to be the actual bloke then. The
In
organised
response to this,
assassination.
Allende imposed a military curfew in the capital and appointed Pinochet to hold supreme military authority in both the capital and the surrounding province. In the months that followed,
You give him a
Augusto
taste of power.
demonstrated what seemed like a firm loyalty to Allende by cracking down
You gave a
strongly
bloke
on
who had nothing
protests
power.
against the president, work which saw Allende make him General Chief of Staff of the Chilean
You've
Army
literally
in
gave someone who
1972,
came from
one of the
nothing,
senior
you
military
gave him
officers
everything he
in the
wanted.
country. But just a year later, Pinochet would be one of the leaders of the coup which overthrew Allende. The Chilean coup
Got put into
d'etat
a
occurred
top
on the
spot
11th of
and took
September
over.
1973. It was initiated by a broad coalition of senior officers within multiple branches of the Chilean armed forces and the policing services in response to the multiple crises facing the Allende government.
So rather than
it was also
fixing it,
supported by the
took over.
US government, which was actively opposed to any left-leaning regimes in Latin America in the context of the Cold War. Pinochet's level of involvement in the planning is unclear,
coup.
but what is wholly evident is that he had just been made Commander-in-Chief of the Chilean Army on the 23rd of August 1973, less than 3 weeks before the coup was
gave
initiated.
him control.
Later, the leaders of the military junta would claim that the military coup was initiated in the autumn of 1973 in an effort to prevent Allende launching a military takeover of his own. In this light, it was claimed that Allende and his supporters in government had determined that the best way for them to be able to govern more effectively was to launch what was termed Plan Z, whereby they would seize greater control over Congress and the armed forces, and thus be able to launch a more concerted policy program than the political deadlock of the early 1970s.
Yeah, except if you have more seats in general, same as any political party, you control the vote, pretty much.
Plan Z, although it is not impossible. When it was launched on the 11th of September, the coup was resoundingly successful. At 7 a.m. that morning, the Chilean Navy captured the port of Valparaiso, the primary naval base in the country.
And everything.
Roads were soon being closed around it, and Santiago and the television and radio networks and other forms of mass communication were seized. Then the Air Force's involvement became clear, as other communication stations that had held out were bombarded. As a result, by the time that Allende and his ministers became aware of what was occurring later that morning, they were unable to communicate to the country or elements within the military who were not involved in the coup.
They've already started it. It's too late.
a.m., the leaders of the coup were declaring that Allende's presidency was at an end, and by 9 a.m., they had seized control of all of the major cities except for the center of Santiago. Allende was now advised to flee from central Santiago and regroup in what would have amounted to the beginnings of a civil war. But he refused this advice, while also remaining determined not to resign his constitutional office. By midday, armed forces had closed on the presidential palace, and shortly after lunch, in what was one of the most ruthlessly effective coups in modern history, the leaders of it were able to declare that Allende was dead.
That's how people win battles now. If you control the communication,
the country.
You've won half the battle.
It was not at
they
all
can't ask for
clear
reinforcements,
as the
can't ask for
dust
help.
settled on the
It's
events
the
of the
waiting
morning
game, really.
and early afternoon of the 11th of September 1973 exactly who was now in control of Chile. And the answer for a while was that no one individual person was,
but how did he become
as
a
occurred
dictator
in
though?
several
If it
other
was a
South
group
American
of them.
countries during this era of military takeovers, a junta was established whereby a council of the chiefs of the various branches of the armed forces would rule in cooperation with each other. In Chile, this consisted of General Pinochet as the recently appointed commander of the Chilean army, Admiral Jose
It's almost like he got the power and
as
went,
head of the Navy,
I need
General
more.
Gustavo
I need more
Lee,
power.
who was in control of the country's air force, and General Cesar Mendoza, the commander of the country's national police, or Carabineros. This junta governed for the next 15 months, ruling Chile as a nation undergoing a period of emergency. Strict curfews and martial law were intermittently imposed. Opponents of the regime were arrested and held without trial, often being tortured or killed, and various other emergency
I guess the
measures
dictatorship's starting to come out now.
However,
if you disagree,
with the
you're dead.
passage of time, a new dispensation was decided upon, whereby the 4 senior members of the junta would be appointed to the office of President of Chile on a rotating basis, with each one serving a term of 12 months before relinquishing the office to the next commander. Pinochet was given a turn first in December 1974, when he became the first post-coup president of the nation. He would not surrender the office for over 15 years.
Wow.
In the immediate aftermath of the
That's
coup,
crazy.
and indeed during the
I've got no
first
idea.
year
Let's
or
do a
two
year
of
at a time.
Pinochet's tenure
We'll
of the
play it fair.
presidential office,
Nah,
much
I've
of
got
the
it now.
regime's
Fuck off.
focus
Not having
was
it.
on consolidating
That's
its
crazy.
control over the country and crushing any form of left-wing or socialist opposition. During the mid-1970s, tens of thousands of individuals who were either associated with the regime or suspected of being so were arrested. Many were detained for extended periods of time without any proper judicial process, and often tortured or held under very harsh conditions. And these were the lucky ones, as they were eventually released. Others were detained and then disappeared entirely, never to be seen
Guarantee if you
again.
went through the hills of Chile in the future, you'll find mass graves.
That
100%.
disappeared. Many of these were first brought to the Via Grimaldi, a detention and interrogation center run by the Chilean secret services, where thousands of opponents of the regime were detained at various times during the 1970s. At least 240 of those who were taken here were never seen again, and it is assumed the regime executed them. Others were taken to various other locations throughout Chile, where they were killed. While there is no explanation today, upwards of 50 years later, for where huge numbers of people went, it is estimated that at least 3,000 people were disappeared by the regime.
Disagree with him, you die, pretty much,
rise
which
to
is
power
a dictator.
and control of the country for a period of nearly 20 years must be viewed within the context of the Cold War. Ever since the collapse of the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba in the 1950s, and the rise to power of the communist regime of Fidel Castro on the doorstep of the United States, successive administrations in Washington had been anxious to prevent the rise of any further socialist regimes elsewhere in Latin America. Accordingly, it had actively supported right-wing regimes throughout Central and South America, and turned a blind eye to flagrant human rights abuses that were perpetrated by these same regimes, the most long-lived of which was that of General Alfredo Stroessner Matielda, the military dictator of Paraguay for over 3 decades between the 1950s and the late 1980s. In the first years of Pinochet's regime, this movement was given additional vigor across South America when the Chilean dictator launched Operation Condor, the code name for an agreement between several of South America's dictatorships to cooperate with each other in stifling democracy in their countries, trammeling human rights, and engaging in campaigns of state terror and murder. It would all be done with the collaboration of the United States intelligence services. For many Chileans, the change of the regime in 1973 was marked by the disappearance of a family member or the detention of someone they knew for months or years without judicial process.
Involvement America have across the world.
The most evident sign of the altered situation in Chile was the striking array of economic reforms and changes that were implemented by the Pinochet regime in the 1970s and into the 1980s. As we have seen earlier, Chile had often favored left-wing governments in past decades, none more so than Allende's administration.
Yeah, because he got into where he wanted to be.
The country had often favored policies that veered towards socialism, most notably in the proliferation of trade unions and the nationalization of services and industries.
Yeah, I swear the UK are currently wanting to do something similar where they nationalise the rail line again.
Nationalization of the copper mining industry, which had previously been dominated by American mining companies such as the Anaconda Copper Company and the Kennecott Copper Corporation. Nationalization of the country's major mines, the 3 largest of which were Chuquicamata, El Salvador and El Teniente, and which these American companies largely controlled, began in the 1950s and was finally completed by Allende's government.
And then they were no longer happy with them anymore.
Visible signs of Chile's left-wing economic policies in the decades leading up to the coup of 1973. Pinochet's regime immediately set about reversing the left-wing drift of Chile's economy in the mid-1970s. A policy was established
here
during
push it to
that
right-wing
time,
instead.
which sought to maximize the economic potential of the country by removing any form of protectionism or state control, in favor of allowing private business to play as large a role as possible in the free market. Thus, state services were privatized. Government efforts
to be honest,
to regulate
I don't
major
disagree with
were
that.
massively reduced.
If you need it,
American
you pay for
and
it.
other foreign companies
I'm just
which had
saying.
been substantially excluded from the country under Allende's regime or had left of their own initiative were re-invited back into Chile. Much of this was owing to the wider international economic context.
Okay.
Pinochet first adopted this policy, which has been labelled as a form of economic shock therapy, in 1975. The global economic situation had taken a brutal blow in the year and a half between the coup of September and the adoption of this new economic platform as a result of the energy crisis which followed from the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, when Egypt and other Arab nations went to war against Israel to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula.
I think I've seen videos
in the aftermath of this, Saudi Arabia led a large embargo against Western nations such as the United States, and this necessarily impacted on the economy of the wider Western world. Chile was particularly affected, as it had already been suffering from huge inflation and other economic woes under Allende. Consequently, Pinochet and his advisors decided to adopt this radical economic program in Chile to arrest the economic turmoil there.
Yeah, to stop it.
From 1975
I don't see what he's doing wrong so far. I get the disappearing's bad, but
back into Chile, but were also
he's trying to fix the economy.
Encouraged to come back, particularly large companies such as Dow Chemical, Firestone, and ITT, which had been effectively removed from the country by Allende's
bringing back
government
Chilean companies to work in Chile.
In Chile. International organizations were also invited in, notably the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and large loans were procured by Pinochet's regime to fund the domestic
economic struggles already, and then you're getting a massive loan to help your country. It's a bit of a brave move there.
In Allende's and some of his predecessors' times were also auctioned off to the highest private bidder. The one area where the Pinochet regime held out against pressure to re-privatize Chilean business interests was in terms of the copper mining industry. Copper mining accounted for a huge proportion of Chilean exports, by some estimates over 30% during the Pinochet regime, and as much as 5% of all economic activity in the country.
Think of how much stuff actually comes out of Chile.
To keep the industry under national control when Pinochet came to power meant that the ideological desire to privatize it once again was resisted, and in addition, the Pinochet regime established
you can see it's copper mill, the water runs
a new state-run company to oversee the massive domestic copper mining industry. All of this amounted to the earliest broad attempt anywhere in the world at introducing what are typically known as neoliberal economic reforms, ones which rejected the Keynesian economic school which had dominated Western economics since the 1930s. These are more usually associated with having emerged in the United Kingdom during the governments of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and her contemporary as President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. The legacy of neoliberal economic shifts such as these is still a matter of fierce debate. For instance, many claimed that free market-orientated reforms, such as Pinochet's government introduced in the 1970s, served to end economic crises in the short term, and began to lead to a rising standard of living for many Chileans in the 1980s. But as in a great many other countries where such reforms were introduced, many contend that over the long term they tend to weaken the fiscal power of the state itself.
So it's a short-term win for a long-term fail.
Furthermore, it could be argued that in the long run, wealth inequality between the rich and the poor in society tends to expand in countries which have adopted neoliberal economic programs.
I can sort of agree with that, since the UK is that.
This seems to have
and the difference between the rich and the poor is very much getting bigger.
Protests
very much getting bigger.
Chile concerning historic levels of inequality in the country, which can be traced back to the policies initially implemented by Pinochet's regime. All of these economic changes were taking place as Pinochet was consolidating his hold over Chile.
He made friends with the old president,
the coup of
military coup that president took over, said to all the people around him, yeah, come on, let's join together, we'll work together, do a year each, and then said, no, no one's having it, it's me now, and then went through all these massive changes.
And police services, with Pinochet initially only meant to serve 12 months before he handed over office. This would never occur. Once he was installed as president, he consolidated his grip on power throughout the second half of the 1970s, sidelining many of his rivals and granting himself ever greater powers. Much of this involved a skilled use of propaganda. For instance, the rank of Captain General of Chile was revived. This had only ever been held by Bernardo O'Higgins, the man who was known as the Liberator of Chile, and who had been the most influential figure in the Chilean War of Independence
they've
during
given
the
someone like
1810s
a hope
and
to
early
bring to
1820s. Now
smart.
Pinochet sought to associate himself with O'Higgins' legacy and depict himself as a new national hero. His military hat was tailored to stand higher than those of other military officers.
I mean,
And in a country that
difference
was
between
profoundly Roman
fighting for
Catholic,
independence of the
a cult
country
of religion
and
was
then
developed,
fighting within your
which
own country. There's a bit of a
proclaimed
difference
him
there.
as a visionary guided by both God and the Virgin Mary. As this cult of personality developed in the late 1970s and Pinochet's enemies were ever more diminished, statues depicting the president in an almost saint-like pose proliferated, some in town squares, some as statuettes which the average Chilean family were advised to keep in their homes. Giant posters of the military commander adorned public places.
Wow.
Much of this was possible because the Chilean military was one of the most rigidly disciplined in South America.
Still, I think, in the world currently.
Room for contenders for power to emerge. Moreover, the secret police services, which had been developed in the weeks following the coup of 1973 to root out supporters of Allende's administration and prominent socialists, were now just as often being deployed to watch individuals within the government who might be plotting anything against the dictator. Instead of there being a wide bureaucratic state of government ministers and civil servants, the bulk of the day-to-day operations of government were often left in the hands of individuals who had been directly appointed by Pinochet and his close advisors.
They're people who actually trusted.
Pinochet established a regime based on personal loyalty to him, and in which the anti-socialist dogma of national security became the justification for severe political repression. All of this was formalized in 1980 when Pinochet held a constitutional referendum to implement Chile's first new constitution since 1925. The proposed new constitution was to give the President of the Republic extensive new powers, a clear effort by Pinochet to solidify his control of the country, while the military junta, which had continued to exercise a large amount of legislative power years after the coup of 1973, was to be largely brought to an end. The choice for voters was clear. Did they want a continuation of Pinochet's regime with heightened powers for the president himself? If so, Pinochet would be appointed for a new 8-year term, following which a new referendum would be held at the end of the 1980s to decide on what would happen next. The result, when the plebiscite on this new constitution was held on the 11th of September 1980, was seemingly conclusive on the surface. 67% of voters approved the new constitution, and Pinochet to remain in power for 8 more years.
He's scared to not sign with like Putin in Russia currently.
By opponents of the
you don't disagree, otherwise you're in prison and most likely you die in that prison.
Whether this was true or not has never been concretely determined. In any event, the result was the same. On the 11th of March 1981, the new constitution came into effect, and with it, Pinochet began a new 8-year term as ruler of Chile.
Oh my God, I bet all the people around him were thinking they were going to be president for a year were raging.
At the outset,
or were raging.
The economic reform program, which had been adopted in 1975, despite being market-oriented and calling for a slimmed-down government apparatus, had nevertheless seen large amounts of borrowing by the Pinochet regime, largely to pay for goods and services. For a time, all of this yielded good results.
To start
in
with.
1975, for instance, gross domestic product in Chile fell by 13%, industrial output plunged by over 20%, and unemployment was nearing 20%. This was all the result of the economic crisis, which started in the 1960s
Chile into its own Great Depression
under Allende, as huge sanctions were imposed on Chile by the United States. Additionally, Chilean inflation had exceeded 350% in 1974, making it the worst affected nation in the world in this respect at the time. However, by the late 1970s, the reforms proposed by the Chicago Boys, a group of Chilean economists educated at the University of Chicago, seemed to be reaping rich dividends as GDP began to rise, inflation declined dramatically, and the unemployment rate also stabilized and began to fall. For instance, after a modest increase of GDP in 1976 of about 3.8%, GDP growth rose to over 10% in 1977, and then
And
stabilized
once
at
again,
an average
because
of
obviously the
8%
rich are staying rich
annually
and the poor are
over the
staying
next
poor.
few years.
That will help the poor
However,
that in that
some of
situation
this
so much more
success had
than
been
the rich
attained by
ever had it.
manipulating exchange rates of the Chilean peso or taking on large amounts of debt. In the early 1980s, this became problematic as Latin America was plunged into a wider debt crisis. This occurred as countries that had borrowed heavily from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and countries like the United States were no longer able to service the interest rates on their accumulated debts, let alone pay back the principal. The Latin American debt crisis was so severe that it plunged the continent into what some economists have called a lost decade. Chile's experience
People
was
just
not
trying
as
to
brutal
survive.
as some of its neighbors, such as Argentina, where the fiscal crisis contributed in large part to the fall of the military junta there and the restoration of democracy. But it was still significant. For instance, Chilean GDP fell to minus 11% in 1982, and the country's economy contracted by a further 5% in 1983. Thereafter, the situation stabilized somewhat, but growth rates would only average around 5% for the remainder of Pinochet's tenure as president of Chile. Thus, what has been referred to as an economic miracle in Chile, beginning with Pinochet's tenure, by some advocates of neoliberal economic theory, was not without its ups and downs.
It's got loads of money to begin with, soon he
broadly,
got his
the
tenure,
domestic
spent
situation
loads of
during
money trying to get
Pinochet's
Chile set
second
up to
period
be
as president
self-sufficient.
was seeing
Of
mixed
course you're going to go through bad
results for
times when you're
ordinary
paying off the
Chileans.
debt you've got,
Often
but once that's paid
GDP
off, you're
and other
then again
ways of
still
statistically
self-sufficient.
assessing economic performance provide a skewed view of how people on the ground are doing. For instance, while Chile's economy did grow considerably overall during the whole 15-plus years of Pinochet's dictatorship, wages actually decreased
Yeah,
across
because everything
the
costs
country.
more over that period of
Though
time.
It is difficult to assess
Everyone's
this in
playing
real terms
catch-up.
as inflation was so high in the early 1970s. Other indicators are clearer though. When it came to the sort of national services which the poor and middle class so often rely on, Pinochet's regime's performance was lackluster. State
Once
funding
again,
for such
the rich
crucial
stay
things
rich and
as
the poor
housing,
stay poor.
hospitals,
That's what it's
schools,
been.
and basic utilities declined in general between 20% and 30% by
That's
the late
horrendous.
1980s on what they had been in the early 1970s. Thus, while there was a lot of wealth being generated in Chile and the economy was growing overall, this new wealth was being funneled into the hands of a minority of business people and those in high-income jobs, while international business interests also did very well out of Pinochet's regime. An indicator of how unaffected by this new wealth creation many Chileans were was seen in how unpopular Pinochet had become amongst ordinary Chileans by the late 1980s. Despite increasing evidence of its human rights abuses at home, Pinochet's regime continued to enjoy good relations internationally, particularly with major Western liberal democracies during the 1980s. Much of this must be viewed in the context of the Cold War. Pinochet's regime
I want to do a video on the
perceived
Cold
as
War
an
at some
ally
point
of
once
the
I find a
US
decent
in
enough
what
bit
was
of
a
content
period of
to
renewed
cover,
tensions
but
between the Western
it's hard to
world
find
and the
correct
Soviet Union.
video of the Cold
It is
War
notable in
because
this
each country
respect
has their own
that
version of what
Operation
happened,
Condor
really.
had sought to establish a cone of pro-US states in South America who opposed the growth of socialism in Latin America. This tendency only became greater in the 1980s as increasing tensions between the Soviet bloc following Russia's invasion of Afghanistan and rivalry over a new space race saw South America continue to remain an area of geopolitical tension.
I almost feel like everyone's rushing
while
ahead
Pinochet's
compared to
regime's
Chile,
record
that's been
of
left
brutalism
behind.
towards its own citizens was dire, a policy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend prevailed. Curiously, this even extended as far as the US partly funding the construction of an extension of the Mataveri International Airport on Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean for use effectively as an American airbase. However, Pinochet refused to attend the opening ceremony in 1987 after Washington called on the Chilean president to address human rights issues in Chile.
So he disagreed with what they were saying.
But despite such lip service, Reagan's regime was always willing to do business with the dictatorship in Santiago. There is no better example of this myopia towards Pinochet's regime amongst Western nations than the case of Chile and the UK in the 1980s. Pinochet's country began to drift closer to London in the late 1970s, owing to the two countries simultaneously developing tensions with Argentina. Pinochet's government had first developed close ties with the military junta that came to power in Argentina in 1976. But in the months that followed, tensions grew over some competing claims to lands along the southern borders of both countries in Tierra del Fuego and the Beagle Channel at the extreme south of the continent. Open war was only narrowly avoided between Chile and Argentina over this in the late 1970s. But in the case of a second conflict which Argentina was engaged in with the UK over the Falkland Islands, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands at the same time, war did erupt in April 1982. The Falklands War would only last just over 2 months before ending in complete British victory. But as a result of it, Thatcher's government in London expanded its connections with Pinochet's regime. Thus, Chile and Colombia were the only two South American nations to actively support the UK position during the war by abstaining in a vote held on the conflict by the members of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance,
obviously we won the Falkland War and it's our land, it's the Falklands.
While Pinochet's government also provided
if you look like a global scale thing,
about
it would have made more sense for either Chile and Colombia to stay out of it, but then again, Chile helped us massively.
For the Western world.
So I can't complain.
The regime's brutality was manifest, and yet the US, Britain and others continued to treat the dictator as a close ally in a geopolitically turbulent period. This is particularly curious, as it was during the 1980s that charges of Pinochet being a latter-day fascist leader gained most currency within opposition circles in Chile and abroad. Much of this characterization came about because of the overt military nature of the regime which he presided over. Pinochet stood at the top of this, a rigidly hierarchical military setup which was modeled on the old Prussian army of the 19th century, officers of which had acted as advisors to the Chileans at that time, and which had done so much to influence the development of the Nazi regime's military in the 1930s.
Okay, so the Prussians came first and then the Nazis came after.
As my general by many within the administration and populace, rather than as president. Moreover, as we have seen, a cult of the leader had been cultivated in the 1970s, with large poster images and statues decorating urban spaces.
Which is the exact same thing which the Chilean dictator did.
That Pinochet's regime had become fascistic by the 1980s. But equally, many scholars have been anxious to suggest otherwise, noting that Pinochet's regime was more in line with the military strongman type which countries like the United States were
I guess he was a dictator, but he didn't be like, I'm a dictator, I'm going to invade your country, sort of thing, whereas Hitler did the exact same thing,
what is clear
but then
is that
attacked other
while his
countries.
official title was that of President of Chile in the 1980s, Pinochet was very much a military dictator. As the end of the 1980s neared, the question of Pinochet leaving power loomed large over the country's politics. The constitution, which had been voted on in 1980, and which had come into effect in 1981,
it pretty much
had
gave
allowed
him
for the
the
president
full power
to
of the
commence
country.
a new 8-year term on an emergency basis. It was understood at the time that after this new 8-year term, a new referendum would be held to decide on whether or not Pinochet should stand for yet another term, or whether
when he's had the power and he's managed to get to that point, of course he will run again or get it again or fix it again.
The prospect of Pinochet acquiring a new term. Much of this could not be stifled. Thus, when he outlined plans for a new referendum in 1988, one which would appoint him for 8 more years, running from 1989 to 1997, Pinochet was also forced to make the concession of legalizing political parties, something which had not existed in Chile.
So he's allowed other parties to run.
Moreover, he faced international calls to allow for a greater level of democracy in the country.
Well, as a dictator,
by President Ronald Reagan of the United
States. Would he do that?
And also Pope John Paul II, whose influence was considerable in a fiercely Roman Catholic
even the
country.
Pope getting involved.
In advance of the referendum of 1988, a coalition of newly re-established political parties, such as the Socialist Party and Radical Party, joined with each other to form a
so
coherent
people
opposition
wouldn't normally
which
work together and join together to
extensively
try and
for a
take
no
down
vote
this
in the
president.
referendum. one which would reject Pinochet's efforts to acquire a new 8-year term.
Because that'd be the only way we have to is by having
when the referendum was held on the 5th of October 1988, the no vote passed with 56% of the vote. It is difficult to say if this means that 44% of Chilean voters continued to support him at this time, or if there was some electoral fraud and the dictator's popularity had fallen much lower.
Well, yeah, because the poll stayed poor.
Is that Pinochet tried to obstruct this democratic drive. Several arms of the state, including the police and secret services, were deployed to try to create false flag national emergencies, which would justify executive overreach. When these measures failed, Pinochet attempted to use the various branches of the armed forces to overrule the result of the referendum.
So you've lost fair and square. Oh, guess what? I'm still general of the military. Take this.
As a result, Pinochet was forced to acquiesce to demands for another referendum in 1989, one which led to provisions for a multi-party presidential campaign later that year. When it was held in December 1989, the leader of the Christian Democratic Party and a long-standing supporter of democratic reform, Patricio Aylwin, was elected.
So he wants the vote to be a vote rather than dictatorship.
President in March 1990, over 16 years after the coup of 1973 had brought him to the peak of Chilean political power. In the years following his removal from power, Chile began to transition back to the democracy that Pinochet's coup of 1973 had done so much to destroy. Pinochet's successor as president re-established the institutions of democracy and also formed a new National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, which sought to investigate the excesses of the Pinochet years and bring closure to an immensely dark period in
you're gone
Chile's
now.
history.
We're going to work out how it let you get this
which
bad.
had been undertaken in neighbouring Argentina a few years earlier in response to the end of its own military junta in the mid-1980s.
Oh my gosh, it's because all the countries back then were just fighting for dictatorships.
Resulted in reports which detailed the disappearance of thousands of Chileans between 1973 and the late 1980s, and the illegal detention of tens of thousands of others. But it did not result in any immediate repercussions for Pinochet himself, in part because the Chilean economy continued to perform well, though whether this was owing to the reforms of the Pinochet era or was the inadvertent byproduct of the global economic boom which followed the end of the Cold War in the 1990s is debatable. As such, Pinochet remained on as Commander-in-Chief of the Chilean Armed Forces despite the brutality of his regime, and he was also made a senator for life following the end of his tenure as president.
So this dude had a dictatorship and still
Pinochet
was a
traveled
senator.
to the United Kingdom for medical treatment for back problems, while there have also been allegations, which have never been proven, that he was there to simultaneously negotiate a covert arms deal. While he was there, Pinochet was arrested in October 1998 on the basis of an international arrest warrant, which had been issued by a Spanish judge, Baltasar Garzón, on the grounds that over 190 Spanish citizens had been killed by Pinochet's regime in Chile during his time as dictator of the country,
190
including
minimum.
the assassination of a Spanish diplomat, Carmelo Soria. Thus, Pinochet was arrested 6 days after the Spanish warrant was issued. He was subsequently held under house arrest for a year and a half in Britain, as the government of the British Prime Minister Tony Blair tried to determine what steps to take next. While detained, requests were made by the former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, whose government had supported Pinochet's regime in the 1980s, to release the former dictator, as well as former US President George Bush. These implorations were ignored, and in March 2000, the UK government finally decided to extradite Pinochet back to Chile, where an agreement had been reached that Pinochet would be placed on trial to answer the charges contained in the international arrest warrant. Over the next few years, in what constituted the last period of his life, Pinochet's fortunes oscillated quite considerably. Precursors to this were seen when, despite the ignominious circumstances of his return to Chile after the issuance of an international arrest warrant and his detention in Britain for well over a year, he was greeted by cheering supporters upon his return to Chile in early March 2000.
Because he was a celebrity, it's like a celebrity
coming to town. The dictator still had a huge base of support at home, and even within the country's government. Thus, just days after his return to Chile, Congress passed a new measure to amend the Chilean constitution and impose a stipulation whereby an ex-president such as Pinochet could not be prosecuted for his or her actions while in office.
What?
An incredible sign of the support which Pinochet still garnered was seen in the passage of the amendment by a majority of almost 80% of members of the Congress. However, this support did not extend as far as the judiciary.
That's
And as
crazy.
a result, in August 2000, the Chilean Supreme Court voted to indict Pinochet for the disappearances of dozens of political opponents during the 1970s and 1980s. Yet, in early 2002, before any judgment could be reached, the case was yet again dismissed on the grounds that the aging Pinochet, who was now in his mid-80s, was both physically and mentally incapable of standing trial.
Oh,
It
so he
seemed
got away
he
with
would
it.
never be fully prosecuted.
He got away with it.
In 2004, the case of the former dictator and president took another turn.
That's crazy.
Early that summer, the Chilean Supreme Court once again overturned
my
its
God.
former ruling and stated that Pinochet would stand trial. Evidence had come to light which suggested he had been
Oh my
engaged in a
gosh.
plethora of illegal behavior after his term as president, notably major bank fraud, money
This
laundering,
dude
and
was in his
secret arms
80s.
deals in the 1990s.
80s and he's
This,
still doing
combined
stuff
with
like that.
confirmatory reports that despite his physical decline, the former dictator was actually sound of mind, combined to see a new
Oh my
decision
gosh.
taken to prosecute Pinochet with several crimes. Crucially, on this occasion, in addition to the charges of having been responsible for hundreds of disappearances, he was also directly indicted for specific assassinations.
So he can't get
For
away
much
with
of
it.
the next 2 years, he would face repeated questioning
Oh
and was
my
often
gosh.
under house arrest. All of this was compounded early in 2005 when the Chilean Armed Forces issued a formal acceptance of and apology for its role in the atrocities
Yeah,
of
but
the
once
Pinochet
again, it's a
era.
dictatorship.
Pinochet
They're
remained
doing as they're
defiant,
told.
though, claiming that if such actions had occurred during his long tenure as dictator and president
But then
of
again, a
Chile,
military coup put him
he
there, a
simply
military coup could have
not
took him out.
remember such acts ever having been orchestrated. Pinochet was already an elderly man by the time he was arrested and then returned
But he
to
doesn't have
Chile
long.
to face prosecution. As such, it was always unlikely he would ever spend time behind bars. But even the vague chance of this was terminated in the final weeks of 2006. On the morning of the 3rd of December, the former dictator suffered a heart attack. This did not kill him, but he did suffer such a setback that, as a 91-year-old man, he never recovered. He was given the last rites the day after the heart attack, though it took until the 10th of December for him to die from what was
He
deemed
died
to
7
be
days after
heart
his
failure
first
and
original heart
pulmonary
attack.
edema. In a sign of the continuing divisiveness which his tenure as
crazy.
president provokes throughout
Brought him
Chile,
back to Chile to get him on trial. He had a
spontaneous
heart
events
attack
broke
and
out
died.
across the country when news of his death emerged, with some mourning his passing and others joyously celebrating.
The
A
richer
decision was
upset,
taken by
the
the
poorer
government
happy.
not to grant him a state funeral, though his body did lie in state at the military academy.
Yeah, gave him a
in
military
Santiago,
funeral, not a state
and
funeral.
flags were flown at half-mast across the country in the days that followed.
Which
When he was
I guess
buried
somewhat
a few
makes
days later,
sense.
60,000 people attended his funeral. However, the armed forces refused to sanction his burial on military property,
Okay.
and as a result, he was cremated, and his ashes were returned to his family.
Oh, so he didn't get a military funeral
Chile
or a
has
state
come a long
funeral.
way today from the country it was during the 1960s and the early 1970s,
That's
and what it became
crazy.
during Pinochet's reign. The country's politics have stabilized after the difficult years of transition, which followed Pinochet's removal from power, oscillating between
But
left
being
and
good in
right-leaning
relationships battle, we
governments.
are we're
The
a
country
democracy
ranks in
now.
the top 50 nations in the Global Peace Index, ahead of other highly developed countries like France, South
Oh,
Korea,
well done.
and Greece. It also has the lowest
I've been to that
homicide
club,
rate
by the
of
way,
any
in the
nation
Eiffel
in the
Tower there.
Americas other than Canada, making it one of the Western Hemisphere's safest places to live, by way of contrast with the experience of life there in the 1970s and 1980s. And economically, it is one of Latin America's most advanced nations, coming in at 43rd globally
Wow.
on the Human Development Index and generally ranking
HDI.
first amongst South America's nations in economic terms. For instance, Chile
Then
has
would
the
they
highest
say that
gross
was
domestic
done
product of any
because
South American country,
of
and is
him,
only
though,
challenged
or
by
because
Uruguay
of that
in terms
democracy's
of
back?
most economic indicators on the continent.
saying.
Yet Pinochet remains a divisive character, with many still holding firm in their belief that his regime's economic policies and other measures pulled Chile back from the precipice of hardline socialism in the 1970s and paved the way for Chile's modern economic performance. There is no doubting that Augusto Pinochet was one of the most significant figures in the history of South America during the 20th century, and is the single most significant individual in modern Chilean history. This is perhaps all the more surprising, given the rather unspectacular manner of his ascent
he was
through the ranks
nothing.
of the Chilean military.
A standard bloke going through his ranks, got to the top, made friends with the president because he's that high up in the military.
By steady, but in no way remarkable promotion. His rise
the military
to become dictator
over.
of Chile came about more as a result of having been rapidly promoted by President Salvador Allende in the early 1970s, and then benefiting from a coup which overthrew the same president
3
in
years
September
after he became friends with the president, he took his job.
Once he became part of the military junta which came to power following the coup of 1973, he showed single-mindedness in pursuing power, which contrasted sharply with his
Which is the problem with the military. People then suddenly crave power they never had before.
He became president of Chile, and he was determined not to relinquish control, only doing so a decade and a half later. Pinochet, it must be noted, has his fans. There were many people in his own time and subsequently in Chile and wider afield who perceived him as being a figure who guided Chile away from a destructive path,
saved it from an economic crisis by getting the money and bringing Chile to be self-sufficient again.
There is no denying that Chile's politics and economy had been bedeviled by unrest between left-wing and right-wing elements throughout the 1960s,
I guess the military coup helped it then, really.
Into the early 1970s. Moreover,
yes, it was wrong what he did, 100%.
That Chile would have drifted
but
into the socialist camp in global politics
Chile?
if it had not been for the coup of 1973.
Okay, I'm not from Chile, so I can't make that decision, but I hope you guys can.
Immense economic and political problems in many states worldwide, most notably Venezuela in South America in recent times. Supporters of Pinochet would argue that he prevented this slide and introduced economic reforms which paved the way for Chile to become the most prosperous nation in South America today. Many perceive the economic reform program championed and implemented by the Chicago Boys in Chile from 1975 as so successful that it inspired Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to begin implementing similar measures in the UK and the US in the 1980s.
And I guess it worked for Chile too.
However, even if one takes this view, there is still no disputing the brutality of Pinochet's regime. While coups are never bloodless, the manner in which the junta and then Pinochet as president pursued the ideological opponents of the new government was especially bloodthirsty. During Pinochet's years in power, and particularly so during the 1970s, tens of thousands of people were detained by the government without any legal basis in Chile. Many were tortured or held for months without any justification, while at least 3,000 people were effectively murdered by the state, though they became known as the disappeared, as they simply vanished from Chilean society without any sign.
Most likely the same as what Pablo Escobar did. Kill them, burn them, get rid of the ashes.
Operation Condor, a program of state terror which was orchestrated by Pinochet's regime and which influenced the behavior of military dictatorships in neighboring South American countries.
So literally the bloke made false flags to stay in power,
enriched themselves at the expense
almost destroying his own country which he wants to rule, to stay in power.
Power and personal aggrandizement were what Pinochet sought, and these were pursued with a fierce brutality. What do you think of Augusto Pinochet? Was he one of the 20th century's most brutal dictators, who lined his own pockets at the expense of normal Chileans and persecuted his own people? Or is he redeemed somewhat by his more successful domestic policies?
No.
Please let us know in the comment section.
Okay, so that was General Augusto Pinochet. I believe that he is now known as the last dictator of Chile. For me, it's a very awkward one because the policies that he set, I understand why he set them. However, the whole idea of having politics is to have a democracy. Having a dictatorship is never going to work. You figure that out because you've had to do a military coup to get to the place where you were at. Now, it's a very tough situation to think about. Then again, I'm not from Chile. I'm not sure how it is there now, currently. But I'd like for people to let me know how Chile. What do you think he is? Was he the good guy, the bad guy, or was he murky, a bit in the middle? But it has been King Sloth. Like, comment down below what you want me to react to next. Subscribe. I reckon we can hit 5k by the end of the year. Let's get it done. Thank you. Peace.